Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today at the session called Catalyzing Science Engagement, Lessons from Around the World. My name is Bonnie Schmidt and I'm the president of Let's Talk Science. I'm delighted to be moderating the panel today from my home office here in London, Ontario, Canada, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Attawandaron, and Wendat peoples. I want to thank, first of all, the Royal Society for hosting us today and for positioning this panel as a plenary session. It's a real testament to the importance of science mobilization and engagement that the Royal Society is placing. It's a great follow-up to yesterday's sessions about the incredible response to the COVID-19 pandemic that was convened by the RSC. I want to thank you all for joining us here today. I know that you've got lots of demands for your time and attention, and so we really welcome the next 75 minutes in which we can have a conversation about science engagement and mobilization. And finally, a huge thank you to our panelists today. We have Jason Blackstock from How to Change the World, Felix Rundle from the Falling Walls Foundation, and Isabelle Delorier from Let's Talk Science. Now, collectively, we're actually covering quite a lot of time zones because we've got representation from the United Kingdom, from Germany, and from Canada, respectively. Now, I'll point out that we all decided not to use slides today, so there won't be any kind of screen sharing, but we want to have an animated discussion, and we really do hope that everybody who's joining us on the call today will get involved. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of how the session is going to unfold, because we really do want you to participate alongside with us. We have lots to share. We have lots to learn from each other. And frankly, anybody who comes to a session like this on science communication and science mobilization are pretty passionate folks that really have lots of good stories and maybe some not so good stories to share with us. We're going to be using Slido, and I think Amber is going to show a URL. And maybe as that's coming up on the screen so you can all get logged in and contribute. I've got the screen over here to be keeping an eye on the conversation as it goes. So here's what we're thinking. Who knows really what's going to actually unfold as we get into this hopefully animated discussion. But the idea is over the next 75 minutes, we're going to divide the conversation into about 4 segments. First of all, starting with a quick overview of the model that each of our panelists are using so that you've got a context for their conversations afterwards. And then we're going to go up to the big picture level and talk about why. Why is it important that we have more of the science community engaged? Here I'll also say that when we talk about science or STEM, we really are talking at a broad level. So engineers, scientists, researchers of all stripes that are getting involved in community outreach. So we're going to talk at the high level about impact, outcomes, and then we're going to talk more about mechanics, logistics, and some of the barriers that we're finding within our own work. And then at the end, we're going to come back to a bigger conversation that's probably a bit more focused on the topic of trust, misinformation, disinformation, and the like. Okay, so with that in mind, you got an idea of the play over the next 75 minutes. Please do submit your questions, your comments as we go along. And I got my computer up here through Slido. We'll keep an eye on it, and I'll do my very best to stay on top of the stream that we can share together as a group. Although this is one-way broadcasting, we really do want to make this as engaging and interactive as we possibly can. All right, so panelists are all ready, and we'll get things kicked off. So we're going to go in order of Felix, then Jason, and Isabelle. A couple of minutes each just to talk a bit about what engagement, mobilization means to you, and a bit of construct around what you do, what your model's all about. Okay, so I'll ask Felix to kick it off and come off mute.
Thanks, Bonnie. I'm really excited to be part of this. Thank you. I want to just start by saying what Falling Walls is all about. Falling Walls was launched in 2009 with the first Falling Walls conference on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And while most of the events happening in Berlin and internationally were looking back at the historical date, this conference decided to look forward and ask which are the next walls to fall and how is that going to change all of our lives. So you can already see the mission coming through. The mission is to build bridges between science and society, to highlight breakthrough research from all over the world. And we started with this conference, and over the years built an ecosystem and a community or communities around this question. What is the next big thing in science and the humanities and in the arts for that matter, and how is that going to change our lives? We launched a few international programs like the Falling Walls Lab that addresses young researchers and allows them to pitch their breakthrough ideas in a short format. And this was rolled out to more than 90 countries over the last year. And I want to talk today about a recent project that we launched just a few years ago, Falling Walls Engage. And this is an international community of science engagement projects that we grow and bring together. This year we were in touch with projects from 72 countries, very different strategies and methods of engagement. And the goal here is to really create a global community that meets digitally, but also physically, once that is possible again, exchanges best practice, creates a visibility and also a shift in perception about what science engagement is and how it's supposed to be institutionalized. And to answer your question about what science engagement means to us, I guess it really is about bridging this perceived gap between academia and society. And this is still where, stereotypical roles come into play. What is a scientist? What is a non-scientist? We really want to create a narrative of science engagement where these two fronts come together, where they interact, where they embrace, where we have a science literate society and a very active scientists that see science engagement as part of their career, of their job description.
Perfect. Well, I guess I'll follow on from there, Felix, and that's actually a perfect segue. Bonnie, let me also add my thanks to you for organizing this and the RSC. Let me start by answering the question, because I think it segues quite well from what Felix just said. And I start with an organization with the very modest title, How to Change the World, which I'll tell you about in a sec. But at How to Change the World, the sort of approach we take to science engagement and mobilization is about bringing diverse communities, interdisciplinary, intergenerational, involving STEM and humanities and stakeholders on the ground together to work on sustainability issues. And we use sustainability challenges at the heart in order to mobilize and catalyze those conversations. And we do it very much oriented around an educational approach where it's geared based on a pedagogy. My day job is technically a professor at University College London, where I founded a department, and How to Change the World is a spin out from there. And we developed How to Change the World as a pedagogy, as a program that we put 900 students through every year at University College London, in order to interact them and their expertise with the real world and to bring in those stakeholders and have those conversations. And so one of the things that we try and accomplish is to make science engagement and part of the broader context of engaging expertise within society to solve problems and make it part of the educational process, not an add-on that sits alongside the educational process, but rather a fundamental part of the pedagogy and the approach of experiential learning. There's lots I could talk about what How to Change the World is, but in short, we now, as the spin-out, the social enterprise spin-out from University College London, we run versions of the program we developed at UCL with other audiences around the world. We've done several in Canada and in South Africa and other African countries and Asia. We continue to expand the reach of these programs, working with higher education institutions. We've got 2 coming up in Canada in February and March. I think that's enough for me for now for an introduction, and I'll pass over to Isabel.
Thanks, Jason. So I'm Isabelle Delaurier, calling in from my office about halfway between Montreal and Ottawa here in Canada. I work for Let's Talk Science. We're a pan-Canadian organization. We've been around, we were founded over 25 years ago. And our goals is really to engage kids in science. That's the ultimate mission we work towards. We have a pretty holistic approach. So we have different programs and different approaches that all culminate into that objective. One of the main ways in which we accomplish our mission is through a volunteer network. So in a typical year, we engage up to close to 4,000 volunteers who are post-secondary students mostly, but also from industry, from academia, in all areas of STEM. And we support them and train them so that they can do primarily hands-on activities, both in a school setting and in community settings, to get kids excited about science, to help kids make friends with science. But there's also other aspects to the organization. So we work directly with teachers, with professional learning, workshops and resources, online resources, different projects that kids, teachers, can participate in, and it all culminates in really the end goal of having kids engage in science. So coming back to that definition of what does it mean for me or for us, engagement in science, for me, it's all about active participation in the process of science, whether you're a child or an adult, knowing that having the confidence to know that you can do science, you can, on a small scale, answer questions and participate in bigger projects, bigger research projects about answering questions through the process of science, and that you're not afraid either to participate in the discussions that happen around science and what it means for you and how it connects to the decisions that you make in your everyday life.
Super. Thanks, everyone. I think that was really helpful to get a broad overview of the perspective. It sounds like there's a fair bit of alignment about what we're using around the word engagement and mobilization, but really distinct audiences, right? With Let's Talk Science, there's a strong focus on how do we engage the post-secondary community and others to reach into the early childhood to grade 12 level. With Jason, really building some internal capacity at the post-secondary level to build courses. And I do want to come back and touch on issues around like sustainability. I think that we can unpack that a bit more in the next hour. And Felix, you started out with the model that was helping scientists become more effective communicators of their own science. And now you've really branched out to creating an infrastructure for the outreach community. I mean, you know, it's actually unbelievable that now you can go through an entire career working in the education and outreach sector in many, many parts of the world. I mean, Canada included. So let's talk about why, right? We actually have seen a rise of a whole sector in which professionally trained scientists and engineers are spending their career doing that, and many, many, many others who are using spare time, in fact, to actually go out and be mobilizing the community at different levels. So why? What do you think are the core needs, the core impacts, and some of the key goals and outcomes that you're trying to achieve? And is it enough? Is it enough? Maybe let's start with Isabelle and then Felix and Jason, and then we can do some interactive conversation about that.
Sure. Thanks, Bonnie. So when I think about this question about why we do the work that we do, I really think about the two main audiences that we seek to have an impact on. And that's both the kids whom we reach and also the volunteers, the post-secondary students who are the volunteers who participate in our program. So I think the impact of outreach is equally important for both of those audiences. So when I think about children and youth, really what's most important for me, and I think for all of our volunteers, is to ensure that every child has the opportunity to know that a career in science is possible for them, that it's a choice, an option that they can pursue, so that we can guide them to know what are the steps that will take them there. And also equally important, not every child is going to grow up to be a scientist, but science is all around them, whatever job they have, whatever their role in society. So just to ensure that they have a positive experience learning science, engaging in science, so that they grow up with a level of scientific literacy that is important and crucial to being a flourishing citizen now. So that's what I think about in terms of what we're trying to accomplish with the kids that we reach and eventually the adults they grow into. But when I think about this, the volunteers that we engage in science outreach, it's very important. We believe very strongly that it's important for every scientist, every engineer, whether you're in academia or in industry, to understand that outreach and communicating to the public and communicating effectively with the public is a fundamental part of their role. If you don't have public understanding and receptiveness to the outcome, what comes out of scientific discovery and engineering accomplishments, it just goes into a void. So not only do our volunteers build a lot of skills when just in the moment of engaging in outreach and so on, but we see that they carry that mandate into the rest of their career and they stay engaged in outreach and education wherever their career takes them. And that's a really big reason of why we choose the approach that we choose.
Yeah, I think I can add another perspective. To me, it's really all about the challenges that we're facing as societies, but also as a global society. On the one hand, imminent challenges, media challenges like polarization, misinformation, alternative facts that have negative effects on democracy and on societies at large, on our well-being, on our physical well-being, on our mental well-being. And then there are the challenges further down the road that we're facing that we know are coming at us: global warming, pandemics, and so on and so forth. So how do we steer? How do we navigate these challenges right now and in the future? Whether you believe in frameworks like SDGs or planetary stewardship, I think you need a planetary crew of citizens that have read the manual, right? That know how to engage with life and with the realities and find solutions, creative solutions, be innovative, but also accept that there are certain basic frameworks and know how they work. So we will talk about scientific literacy later and trust in science. I'll keep that for later. But this is the big why that drives what we do. How can we help and be like a little have some effect in this change towards a more literate global population, and what Falling Walls Engage is trying to do. So we're not working directly with target groups, with citizens, but we're working with those that have projects that are already running, that are already successful, that are already growing, and we're helping them co-learn, get together, scale, translate their best cases, also their not so successful cases. So just a learning community that really can be effective, that is spreading out, that also acts as ambassadors and as role models for scientists that want to learn how to engage. And I think this is something that all of us share with the science engagement community at large, this sense of urgency that something needs to be done, that we need to change not just infrastructures, but also mindsets, most of all mindsets.
It's a hard act to follow, Isabel and Felix. So I'm going to just use this as an opportunity to plug the audience to please do enter some questions for us so that we can actually engage your questions as well. But I'll just say that I completely agree with both Felix and Isabel in two of the main drivers, the whys it's worth doing this, and also why, Bonnie, to your point, this has become an exploding field of opportunity of jobs within engagement. One is the challenges that Felix outlines. I'm wearing the UN Sustainable Development Goal pin precisely because all of our education programs are anchored on the SDGs and trying to bring together the stakeholders in order to interact. And I think to Felix's point that I would just echo and reinforce, science and engineering are great. but they can't solve the problems on their own. We've seen time and time again that technologies developed in the lab that don't engage the end users end up sitting in the lab on a shelf there and not actually having the impact in the world we intend them to. We need a lot more. Engagement has to be about a two-way conversation that brings together science and engineering and STEM writ large with social sciences and humanities and with real stakeholders on the ground in order to have those conversations. And that's a big why for science engagement. And to Isabel's point, one of my favorite lines, it comes from a political speech, well, a TV version of political speech. A child born today can live to see the 22nd century. And if that doesn't make you think about the need to ensure that the upcoming K to 12 are engaging in that conversation about what science means for their lives, I don't know what will. I also want to just put a third answer to this why question, though. And Bonnie, it comes back specifically to the point that you raised about why has science engagement expanded so much in the last couple of decades. I also think there's a certain amount of pragmatism to it. The size of the higher education and higher research apparatus is larger than it has ever been. And it's drawing on the public purse more than it ever has. And so there is a certain amount of pragmatism with universities recognizing if we can't explain to the public why what we do is valuable, and if we can't ensure it's valuable, actually we're not going to get the money to do it anymore. And I live here in the UK. For those familiar with that sort of discussion, there's something called the impact agenda here, which has been running for 15 years. An ever bigger chunk of core funding for research and science and education here in the UK is directly tied to, can you explain why this matters? And that is ultimately science engagement. And I think those three things together are all a really good intersection of the motives for why we do this.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And Jason, you really called out a good point about how the social contract for science is changing, and we'll come back and talk about that a little bit later. I love, Felix, the comment, what did you say? We need a planetary crew that has read the manual, right? I really like that. So let's talk a little bit about that manual. Earlier this year, I was really honored to be part of a PISA panel. And we were charged with looking at the international science test. So they convened a group of folks, largely scientists and engineers, to take a look at this international science test. It has become a bellwether for science education, and it provides a really interesting anchor to be thinking about, should education and the definition of scientific literacy change? All three of you talked about the why. You also all talked about some of the core elements about having that larger interaction with the public and with scientists and engineers. So is it time to change the definition of scientific literacy? And if so, what do you think needs to change about it? It's been pretty anchored in very traditional definitions for quite a long time. Who wants to take this one on first?
I'm happy to throw out an idea, and it might stir up some controversy, but I'm always happy to do that. The tests that measure numeracy and the ability to understand science when you're reading in a test is a great starting point. But in today, just take a look at whether it's climate change or any of the sustainability issues or the debate that's been going on in the US around the last presidential election, and even the ability to determine facts. A lot of it, where people get their information from today is not where they used to get it 10, 20, 30 years ago. There's a different way of trying to interpret and understand, and it's much more dialogue-based than it is the sort of fact-based tests that you go through and do. English literature, philosophy, take your pick of some of those social sciences are much better at analyzing qualitatively how much people have been able to understand and have a conversation about issues. And we've never really incorporated that into the concept of science literacy and the ability to take an idea and debate and discuss it in these sorts of tests. And of course, it adds a hell of a lot of challenge in terms of marking those sorts of things, because you're reading essays, you're not doing multiple choice, you're not doing numerical answers. So it pushes the boundary of what we think about testing in that way. So I think that's one thing that I would say science literacy needs to be about the ability to engage in a dialogue and discussion, not just do I believe this fact or not? Do I understand this fact or not? It's not nearly so binary anymore.
Good point. And actually, there was a whole new area that in the PISA test is being suggested, and it's around the whole concept of science identity. And in that particular area of recommendation, some of what you were talking about, the ability to actually assess and argue in different cases. Either Felix or Isabel, do you want to chime in on scientific literacy?
Yeah, I can riff off of what Jason was talking about a little bit. I think, fundamentally the definition of science literacy doesn't necessarily change, but the context in which we're applying it does. And the biggest factor that I think I have seen change in my lifetime is just the way in which we interact with information. And when I think about my early exposure to science, there was so much emphasis on how do you get the information that you need to get to, like how do you find the right book, those kinds of things. And now it's just this avalanche of information, and it's not as much about like how do you get to the information, but how do you discriminate between information and what's what's relevant, what isn't, what's trustworthy, what isn't, and we'll come back to that. But I think that shifts from being able to acquire knowledge to being competent with how you manipulate information and thinking through and critical thinking and all those kinds of things. So I think it's more heavily leaning towards that side of things now.
That's great. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Felix?
I really agree with you, Isabel. The level of complexity that now needs to be dealt with in science, but also in the rest of the world, is just so immense, and the skills needed to understand or even just get an idea of what's behind this complexity is different. Sometimes that scares me. Like in my mind, I draw a comparison to the Enlightenment period. So now we have a hyper accelerated science and innovation development that is going to accelerate even more in the next years with automation and AI and the biotech revolution. So we need something like a hyper enlightenment or a second wave of enlightenment that will make sure that with a limited amount of time, these skill sets are made available and are going into education and curricula. I think it's a massive challenge if you look at it like that. And I really like the scope of the vision that the PISA strategic paper brings in. It's absolutely appropriate.
Thanks, everyone. So I want to maybe tease out the word enlightenment a little bit. And none of you, I was a little bit surprised, talked about potentially the changing nature of how we teach science. We're still very much teaching it from a Western science perspective. And before we dive into how we're actually operating, I was wondering if anyone's got any thoughts about thinking about other ways of knowing as part of a potentially expanding definition of science literacy. We've heard increasingly about Indigenous ways of knowing and how it can be very complementary to Western and traditional science. Any thoughts on that, Isabel?
Sure, I can jump in, and I'm going to go back to something that Jason said in his first answer, which was about the value of the two-way conversation as well. And, it made me think about a time where I was doing outreach in the Northwest Territories, and we were doing a workshop on climate change. And we were talking about pulling ice core samples, and we had a hands-on activity with different layers, and they would count like how many carbon molecules and so on to find evidence about whether the climate was changing or not during the period of time the ice core came from. So that's a very like traditional Western science kind of approach to it. But the first question we asked to the kids in the classroom was, so this was in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories. We asked, what are some things that you've heard in your community, either from elders or from family members or from teachers and so on, that you think you might be able to connect or that your community connects to climate change? And the kids talked about everything from like one of their main modes of transportation in the winter is driving on the Mackenzie Yangtze River, which freezes over. So there's an ice road. So they talked about, it used to freeze over in October and now it doesn't anymore. We can't go fishing in the same places that we used to, migration paths, camps that weren't able to be used anymore due to different patterns in erosion, fires, and so on. And it brought to me really to light the richness of when you're able to look at the information and the evidence in front of you from different perspectives. So many people refer to that as two-eyed seeing. So both the traditional knowledge perspective and the science perspective, and how they can really build onto each other. So that's really something that I saw really come alive in the classroom that day. And just taking a moment to elicit that knowledge really, I think, shows how you can really tie it all together. And the same week, I had a chance to attend some research talks at Aura Research Institutes in the same community, and to see how that was affecting like groundbreaking research as well. So there was a visiting researcher who was studying different, I think it was caribou population, and just interacting with the elders who had like different vocabulary that they used in their own language to talk about different subpopulations of the animals, help them recognize how like the genetic diversity and how there were these subgroups that aren't all part of a uniform population. So, I think those are just two examples that show both how that kind of two-eyed seeing can take place in the classroom or in an outreach context as well as in a research context.
Great.
And I think, Isabel, one thing I just want to quickly add on to that, I could not agree more with the importance of that sort of opportunity. I think one of the things that I would drive home, particularly given many who I think will be the audience to this, is we don't integrate enough of that into the standard STEM curriculums at university. The programs that we run with How to Change the World, you mentioned Inuvik. One of the challenges that we've used in 2 of our programs this year that we ran in Canada was Inuvik, and we had the mayor of Inuvik and the Inuvialut Regional Corporation, local stakeholders involved in this sort of video conference with engineers, scientists, early career professionals. And all too many times the feedback we get from the students is, this is the first time I've ever had a chance to talk about what I've learned from a technical point of view with someone who is living in the real world and needs to apply this in their context, and their knowledge helps me contextualize and link up everything that I've learned from the textbook in the classroom with the real world and those perspectives. So I think it's those different ways of knowing are so critical for those interdisciplinary, intergenerational conversations. And I think that's something we don't take into account enough in the design of our modern STEM curriculum.
Super. Thanks for that. We've got some questions coming in now through the chat. So I'm going to move us on and we can come back to this topic again, which is really important in the next segment. So for the next few minutes, I want to turn our attention more to some of the mechanics of what we're doing, some of the barriers, some of the key features for success. Like, how do we actually engage and mobilize the community? A couple of questions that have come in. I'm going to just tell you them so you can think about how to work it into your answer. So Matthew asks, if you could wish for anything that would radically catalyze your work, what would that be? And then the second question from Sam, do you have any best practices on getting scientists to be willing to and start to engage with the public and or policymakers? Other requests, I'm hoping my technical abilities are not so great, but we were asked for a link to the PISA. So if somebody can maybe just Google PISA 2024 experts panel and throw it in the chat, that would be awesome. So let's go Jason, Isabel, Felix, a little bit more mechanics, barriers, features, success. Thanks.
Perfect. I'll start with Matthew's question. The academic answer is, of course, just a whack load more money always helps, but that's the academic answer. The real answer that I would give to what could radically catalyze the work that we're doing. One of our main aims of spinning out How to Change the World from University College London was to help catalyze change within higher education. Higher education and the way in which we teach our undergraduate degrees and even our graduate degrees, if you look back, was actually designed somewhere in the 12th to 18th centuries in terms of the basic models that were developed. And it's absolutely evolved a considerable amount in the last 70 years. But if you were going to start with a blank whiteboard and redesign a knowledge system for the 21st century that has interdisciplinary, intergenerational knowledge generation and application to real world problems, you do a whole bunch of new things like catalyze more experiential education. And there's lots of and so this gets to the question of what do we do? What's our model for the how? The way in which we built How to Change the World was to take real world problems in local context, like a NUVIC, and say, what are your sustainability challenges on the ground? Great. We're now going to get a whole bunch of engineers and scientists and business students and policy students together and put them together to work on your problem, trying to first understand what your problem is, what you define as being the challenges you're facing from sustainability, and figure out how your technical expertise matches into that. And we bring in a whole bunch of real world professionals to help them with that process of figuring out what problem they can actually contribute to. Then they go through the more standard hackathon approach of once they've defined a problem with the stakeholders, how do you solve it? But when we have 50 students working in teams of 5 with those local stakeholders, they'll come up with 10 different answers to what is the problem they're working on in the first place. And as a result of that, you end up with a whole bunch of really interesting and different conversations going that is learning for the local stakeholders, that is learning for the experts, the senior experts who come in and converse, and for the students, all about how different knowledges can be mobilized to tackle sustainability challenges. One of the things, ironically, that to wish for in some ways, I hope that the change that the massive disruption and pain we've suffered from COVID has caused, I hope that helps universities transform the way they're delivering the education. Because moving into this format, rather than the old school, I'm on a blackboard and I'm just writing things or I'm lecturing at you for an hour, we've opened up new opportunities to change the way we're delivering education as a result of this. And I really hope that we hang on to that and use it as a catalyst to evolve faster in terms of engaging other stakeholders and thinking about the redesign of higher education with many more stakeholders involved. Isabel, I think it's over to you next.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. So I'm going to tie Bonnie's question to Sam's question that was asked in the chat around any best practices on getting scientists to be willing to and to start to engaging with the public. So we know from our volunteers who are students, STEM students and post-secondary, so all levels, undergrad, master's, PhD across Canada. So we know that one thing that really makes a difference with them is to be encouraged by the professors and their supervisors at the university level to participate in outreach. It means a lot. For them to see that endorsement. It's one of the biggest reasons when we ask them, like, what would encourage you to participate in outreach and so on. And we know that that's not always the case, unfortunately. So I think a lot of academics do see the value in this type of work. But, we do have stories of students who feel like they need to sneak off and do their outreach on the side and those types of things. And that's really unfortunate. I really hope one of my hopes of something that I hope is changing is I hope that what is known as the Carl Sagan effect is on its way out. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with that term, but Carl Sagan, who of course had very influential research, but he was also a superstar science communicator when he was nominated to membership to the National Academy of Sciences. That nomination was not successful. And in retrospect, there was a lot of it gave rise to what is called the Carl Sagan effect, thinking that probably his status as a science superstar doesn't help. So that sometimes if an academic spends a lot of their time on science popularization and so on, it's seen as being at the expense of their other academic pursuits, where in fact it is not. So there's a good correlation with somebody who engages in science outreach and communication, typically perform very well in research as well. So it's been shown that that's not, there's some misleading assumptions in there. So I think it's changing to some extent. I think there's more value that's seen in taking on that role of science communicator. But I don't think the Carl Sagan effect is completely gone. But I hope that we'll see it continue to diminish, and to see more people encourage their students to participate in science outreach as well. I know for us, that's key to the way we operate, and I've already mentioned our model depends a lot on post-secondary students acting as role models in the classroom, doing hands-on activities. And it's not just about teaching the science concept and so on, but it's also about talking about their pathway, how they got to where they got, why they're studying, what they want to do afterwards. So the more supports we have for that, the more we can reap the benefits as well on both the students, the young students, K-12 students, as well as the post-secondary students.
I'm going to start by answering Matthew's question. I think if I could wish for anything that would radically catalyze the work that we're trying to do, it would be, well, some top-down changes, because a lot of the things we do are bottom-up, and still I think for the big paradigm shifts that are required, we need some top-down mechanics as well, which includes changing funding structures, including science engagement in academic funding in the broader scale, and in changing policy in some cases, changing university policies, changing education, and these. If I had a magic typewriter, I would put someone very smart and very engaged from the science engagement community onto it to help rewrite some of the laws that currently govern the context in which science engagement is embedded, and really give it much more space and much more visibility, and that would probably help a lot. And also that would help with a lot of money, like you said, Jason, which is needed because we have a lot of successful examples and models for great science engagement, which could be scaled, which could be translated to other places in the world, to other target groups, to other contexts. I think that's creativity and innovative models are not the issue. And this is really where our own model starts, is by trying to find all of those approaches and models for science engagement out there in the world, and not just those that are, the usual suspects or the obvious players, but also the hidden champions that we try to find through scouts that we have in several parts of the world that help us onboard these projects that are somewhere in the periphery to the larger community, give them access to the knowledge that is accumulated there, give them access to the co-learning opportunities, to some visibility to some degree, and allow a community to grow that will also be decentralized. It's not about us deciding on every principle of co-learning and exchange, but we have started a series of rolling out a series of international hubs this year, starting pre-pandemic with physical meetings and hubs in Kenya. Then we had to move to the digital realm in Sweden, in Argentina. We're planning to roll out 25 steady, continuous international hubs by the year 2025. And really in that way, help connect the regional, the national, and the international, in that sense that all of the local players are in the end connected on a bigger platform internationally, allowing them to engage in this kind of co-learning and in the scaling. And we've seen this has only been running for 1.5 years under the umbrella of Falling Walls Engage, but we've already seen successful examples of how this translation works. one science engagement project that was successfully running in one city has expanded to several other cities by power of the network. One model that was used in one specific context of a target group has been translated to another target group. This is something that we can see, but ultimately, I think most of the projects that we're working with would benefit from much more funding, from greater visibility, from a higher position in the food chain. And this is basically what we're working on with in the context of global perception. How do these projects gain more perception? How does our shared cause gain more perception in the realms of policy, also business? And this is how we, by a platform type of approach, try to push forward the change. And just to touch upon Sam's question, something that we also try to do with Falling Walls Engage is to create a recipe book, or, well, in the form of a digital platform, access to an overview of all the working models, of all the profiles of science engagement projects that we are in contact with, so that these models can also serve as an inspiration or as blueprints for other, well, scientists or other people who want to start their own science engagement projects. That way, you just create this overview, accessibility to find out what works for you, what's the target group that you're enthusiastic about, that you want to work with, what works for your scientific background. And so trying to create this kind of, as I said, a recipe book for great and working science engagement.
Thanks so much, Felix. Jason, I think you had a
I just wanted to pick something up from what Felix had said and Isabel's point about the Carl Sagan effect. And I think particularly given the audience and that this is the RSC, the concept of what excellence means in academia, in higher education, is, I think, at the heart of some of these questions. To Felix's point about top-down, or the idea that we reward, that these are higher education institutions, that's what we call them, higher education, but yet faculty are rewarded based on research. They're based on the research they produce. I often, I'm a professor in a university and I make fun of myself this way, but I often crack the joke. It takes a 4-year degree to teach kindergarten, but it doesn't require any training in education to become a professor at a university. Now, thankfully, we've moved away from that quite a bit in the last 15, 20 years. But we really have to have a conversation about what excellence and reward frameworks means. And that goes to things like the question that Nick asked, any best practices on getting institutions to support the effort of scientists turned engagers. Nick, I wish I had the magic bullet, but to Felix's point, some of this does have to happen at the university president's level, at the conversation about what are we actually rewarding in terms of promotion and tenure, and who counts as faculty and who just gets a staff job because that's not considered to be academic enough. That's a fundamental question that I think we need to be tackling head on in order to really open up the value. And this relates also to the question that Val asks, any advice on finding audiences or groups to engage with? I have researchers who want to engage but sometimes struggle to find partners. All too often, we have prepared researchers to go out there and say, this is the research I've done, somebody let me tell you about it. And to be honest, there's a lot of news coverage that's going to compete with that and make it hard. If a researcher walks out of the lab and asks, what's your problem and how might I be able to help with it? You get a completely different response. And in fact, you can get overwhelmed and inundated with just being asked too much. In terms of, oh, I have this problem over here, and this one here, and this one here. And I think that's an approach that we need to be putting at the heart of things. I saw Isabel wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I think Isabel's probably got some thoughts around community partners and how to identify them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Val's question absolutely caught my eye as well. So just to add to what Jason was saying, I mean, there are partners who want you. There's overwhelming demand for teachers who want to have scientists in the classroom. That it's just a question of getting connected. I would encourage you to connect to an organization who has the logistics and the administration around those types of partnerships down path. Whether it's Let's Talk Science or another organization, we are present in 50 different universities and colleges across Canada, so there's a good chance there's one near you. And, I can tell you we are never able to fulfill all the demand we have from teachers and schools, so we'd be happy to work with you and just take care of the administration and the logistics and finding the classroom who wants to have someone come and do something with them that's aligned with what the messages you're wanting to get across. That's not a problem. So definitely see what's available in your community and around you. And a little bit along the lines of what Jason was saying, I think it's important to be really open-minded about the approach, like what the approach is going to end up looking like. So, be ready to be challenged to make it hands-on. That's really a good way to get the information and the engagement with kids. Get ready to be challenged to help to connect the topic you want to talk about or your research to curriculum expectations in the K-12 classroom. So teachers are under a lot of pressure to cover curriculum expectations, to connect so the learning outcomes for each grade level that are expected and so on. This isn't meant to be like overwhelming that we've all kind of learned this over the years. It's pretty straightforward, but we're here to help. So I would definitely encourage you to connect with someone who can help you with those aspects.
Super. Felix, do you wanted to add to that?
Just to add to what Jason and Isabel said, very briefly, I think the question here is already part of the answer, in the sense that really being aware of which group you want to work with is the first step, and then finding the right method and being creative about it. Really, from what I've learned over the last years and in being in touch with some very brilliant science engagers out there, I think one part of the recipe is to work with something that is close to your heart. Also work with a real world topic that is close to your heart. I'm not a researcher, but I would probably pick something with football or sports, because that's where I hang out on the weekends. But in other cases, it's really about the communities that you are in, that you are a part of. So these communities that you know best. At Falling Walls Engage, we had just two amazing examples on astrophysics, science engagement in astrophysics. Just this year, the breakthrough of the year in science engagement that we awarded to a astronomer who is blind himself and creates solutions for other blind students to engage with astrophysics with 3D printed models of astrophysical objects. This is revolutionary, and this is tackled, of course, very closely to a specific need of an underserved community. Another astrophysics project that worked with conflict parties, children in a conflict zone, to bring together people from different groups over the subject of space and science. So I think that's a great step to finding what you want to work with, a group that you're closely connected with, and then be very creative about the topic and let yourself be inspired by what others are doing.
Super. I'm going to take moderator privilege because I think we could probably keep telling stories. And just tying this section up a little bit, I think it's not hard to find an audience if you have an infrastructure in place, like Isabel was saying, and people are really curious. They are interested in science and engineering. I think we need to do a better job in helping the scientists community to understand the audience. I think, Jason, you touched on not requiring a lot of education training in order to teach. I think one of the biggest experiences that I've had over, the 30 years since I've been doing this has been this implicit kind of misunderstanding about really understanding the age, the cultural attributes, the context of the audience, and really thinking about how to present and engage what you're really passionate about in a way that will actually engage the audience, the listener. And I think all of you have touched on that. But we need to find more ways to train as well. There's definitely a growing number of professionals who want to do more of this kind of engagement activity, and we need to figure out better ways. I don't think it's adequate to just have like lay abstracts as part of scientific grants, as, you know, checking off a box for communicating out in lay language. I think we really do need to invest more, and Let's Talk Science has done a fair bit of that over the years as well. I'd like to switch us really quick, Jason.
Really quick. It's a really quick thing, because the one thing that I want to make sure people absorb is you don't have to be at the front of the room talking about your science to do science engagement. That is certainly one component to it, but you can very easily be supporting others with their problems and talking to them. And there are other infrastructures around things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and places you can get involved. And trust me, every branch of science, there's policymakers, there's users on the ground who are looking for your expertise. Find those, and it will bring to bear what you're trying to contribute.
Super, thanks. And I do want to just touch on something that's come to me in the private chat about our inability to post the PISA Strategic Experts panel paper publicly for everybody. So those of you who want to find it, just Google PISA 2024 Strategic Experts panel. It's the first thing that will come up as a PDF. Okay, we've got about 18 minutes left. I want to spend a little bit of time, again, going up to the big picture and talking about trust. I don't think I've thought more about trust in science over most of my career as I have in the last 8 months during the pandemic. We're hearing about worry of vaccine acceptance, hesitancy potentially. What is it about trust? What is giving rise to misinformation, disinformation? Like, what some people are saying, you know, trust in science is eroding and it's disappearing. To the contrary, I do think there's probably fraying around the edges for sure. But all of the polls that have come out, whether it's Pew Research report, whether it's the 3M survey, and others that I've seen over the last year, still place scientists in the top category of those who are trusted by the public. So as trust in institutions declines, in some cases quite rapidly, and trust in science does seem to have an ideological connection. So countries that are, you know, perhaps a little bit more right focused seem to profess a bit less trust in science. What are your thoughts about trust? What are the features and the factors that are all part of being trustworthy as a science community? And is that element a part of what we need to be thinking about when we talk about mobilizing the community? Who wants to take this one on to start? Isabel.
Sure. So I think we have to be a little bit careful when we talk about trust in science. We're not after blind trust either. It's sometimes hard for the public to distinguish between you know, an actual scientist and someone who uses the trappings of science. I remember just from more at the beginning of the pandemic, seeing an image and it said something like, these 50 doctors all think that you shouldn't wear masks. And it was like Zoom call tiles and so on. I started to, you know, I just thought that can't be right. And I started to Google the names that you could see and find like, oh, okay, well, a lot of them are not doctors. If they're doctors, they're maybe not medical doctors, doctor of theology, of naturopath, homeopathy, things like that. So I think I would ask a question, like, we don't want to have a society where people trust someone just because they put doctor in front of their name in a Zoom call. But, you know, people that feel comfortable that, you know, I can take this and I can do a few Google searches and find out who this person really is, and I can interpret what I find about them and like critically think about science. I think it's more important to be able to critically think about science than to trust science.
That's a really good point.
That's
Jason?
a great point, Isabel. And I think one of the ways, take the pandemic as a great example, where whether it's in the US or the UK, I haven't been in Canada in a while, so I haven't paid as much attention there. But in the UK, we have something called the SAGE group, Science Advisory for Government Emergencies. And it's actually a big group of scientists that are producing reports, and those reports get published. Of course, the ability for most people to pick up those reports and make sense of them is incredibly limited. And to Isabel's point, yes, we can increase scientific literacy, but the real question about trust in science and how much the public trusts it relates at least as much to what the chief medical officer here in the UK says when they stand next to the prime minister making announcements that are half policy, half government direction, half science. And yes, there are three halves there, and that's exactly my point. It doesn't add up when you're trying to put all of those pieces together. There's going to be tensions. And I think one of the reasons we've seen an erosion of trust in science is because it gets convoluted. When Fauci is talking from the point of view of being a scientific expert at the CDC, and he's followed by Trump, I'm sorry, you're going to have a blending of the science and the political in a way that's unavoidable. And I think one of the most difficult things for us as scientists, I'm a physicist and I spent quite a bit of time doing fundamental physics research, and that's how I got into climate change. But as I moved into climate change, one of the first things that I realized is there's a very blurry spectrum between what I can know scientifically and what I believe is important for us to do as a society. And somewhere in there, the science very clearly has ended, but where that ends is a fuzzy boundary. Renewable energy, how efficient is it? What are the cost points? There are pieces of data that you can get, but ultimately you're making a lot of judgments that are laden with values as well. And this comes back to this conversation that we've had about education and preparing scientists to get into this public engagement domain. It's one thing if you're talking about issues that people find fascinating, like astrophysics, but it's not clear that's going to have a policy ramification in terms of the decisions that affect your life day to day. The second you move into vaccines or climate change or areas where individuals feel, hang on, the choices made on that science is going to affect me directly, we have to understand that it's going to raise, going right back to conversations we had earlier, it has to become a dialogue. It's not just about science fact being thrown. It's about science knowledge in a discussion with other forms of knowledge that are equally valid and equally important in the conversation. And again, we need to prepare and support and create frameworks and environments where those discussions can take place. And ideally, we'll start, kind of like we did with How to Change the World, in the undergrad programs and thinking about integrating that from the foundation of how we teach STEM at higher education.
You use the word value there, and I think the context for the discussion is really important. Areas that are personally connected, like the vaccines, looking at other health issues, looking at nutrition and food issues. I think as scientists, we sometimes forget the cultural context and the personal behaviors, the wants and needs that individuals have, and the ability to have this disconnect, like you have your cultural values and then you get overlaid with the science information and trying to figure out how to differentiate it. So the public is not necessarily thinking that the science community is understanding that cultural construct and perhaps not considering their needs and their desires. It might continue to be really, it might continue to happen that people are kind of having this dichotomy of thinking. What are your thoughts about how we go about ensuring that scientists and engineers who are out there are thinking about that cultural construct in which they might be finding themselves in the engagement world? Who wants to talk about that?
I'll just add an anecdote that I think segues that conversation nicely, as you alluded to it. When I was first getting involved in climate change, one of the senior scientists who'd been involved in the climate negotiations turned around and said, So this was mid-noughties, and they turned around and said, if in the late 80s, scientists testifying before Congress had got up there and said the solution, that what they said was the solution to climate change is a global carbon tax, because that was what all the evidence said in the 80s. You have local taxes for local issues, you do global one. And the scientists turned around and said, if they had for some reason come up with it's local climate entrepreneurship, the Republicans would have been all over climate change as the next big thing to focus on, as opposed. So I think that really drives home the fact for me that as a scientist, I could never have known that. None of my physics courses, none of my atmospheric chemistry courses, none of my modeling courses could ever have prepared me to understand local entrepreneurship is Republican, global taxes is Democrat. And I'm oversimplifying there. But the whole point is it's those sorts of value-based dichotomies never showed up in my education at all. And we need more of those opportunities for dialogue right from the beginning of when we begin to teach this, so that it's not, we'll teach you the science over here in the classroom and go do that engagement stuff with other stakeholders over there. And it creates a real tension for those who are, for the faculty who do have to get across all of the technical detail. There's still a lot of technical stuff to go through. So how do you blend that? Experiential learning models like Olin College, MIT's experimenting with now. There are frameworks out there, but it's a big shift in how we teach in order to accomplish that.
Super. When it comes to thinking about trustworthiness, there's been some interesting work in trying to think about trust as an equation. And there's a book called, The Trust Equation, Trusted Advisor. If you think about it from the science context, some of the factors that we might want to unpack a little bit would be, trustworthiness is directly related to integrity, right? To issues around transparency of the system, to reliability. Have we let anybody down before? And if so, have we been clear about it? And inversely related to conflict of interest, whether it's real or perceived. So thinking about that whole equation of the factors that go into building trustworthiness, do you have advice about how we can ensure that we're thinking about it as a community as we're looking at engagement?
I think I don't really have advice, but I have an interesting example for what you just said. During the pandemic now, in Germany, the trust in scientists and also the debates around science have been boosted, obviously, like many other places. But in Germany, I think it really had the very positive effect that we could have many of these debates about the basic principles of science, the scientific method. That there are truths that are being overhauled, that are being that have to be made relative afterwards. That there are sometimes mistakes and errors in science as well, and this was all debated in public TV and with many engaged scientists, virologists that. We're standing in and we're explaining and really not just talked about the COVID-19 itself, but really about how do we find vaccine candidates? How do we then go on to distribute them in the population? What is going to happen in this crisis? And I think with all the catastrophe that COVID-19 is and is still bringing to us, that is a very positive side effect that we have a clear case on which to debate the role of science and to address a wider public. And so I think that's worth highlighting. And then the question to me is what to do with this trust. Do we also, as a scientific community, gain more self-confidence to engage now in other issues that are equally important in the future? Climate change was mentioned. Did we derive some learnings from the conversations during the pandemic around COVID-19 about engaging with the public that help us tackle these other problems as well? And as we said, we have enough of these challenges to tackle. So I think that's my main point, what to do with the trust, what to do now that we know that trust is at an all-time high. In Germany, it was boosted by the pandemic. Food for thought. Maybe one of the other panelists wants to chip in.
It's definitely a complicated situation, but tying together an earlier conversation around how do we get institutions to embrace the mobilization and engagement of scientists. Do you think, or how do you think we could leverage this growing need that governments and others are starting to talk about around needing to trust, right? If people don't trust a vaccine and we don't get to broad enough vaccination levels, then we are going to continue to be dealing with a very, very challenging environment. So might there be a way to weave together some of the issues that came up earlier with leveraging this particular point in time? And what are other things that we might be learning from the COVID-19 communication opportunities that we've been seeing?
I think one lesson that I would take, and it comes from the example that Felix was talking about with Germany, the way in which science is either politicized or turned into something that is treated as apolitical and available for everyone makes a huge difference. And that's, in the US, it has been extremely highly politicized, but that's hardly the only place. Look at Brazil as another really a painful example of where science has been politicized, or the issues have been politicized because it has linked to values as opposed to a conversation about the science on the side and then a debate about the values. That requires not just our scientists, but our political leaders to be engaged in that conversation. And I think that's one of the things that I would say, bringing it back to the scientists who are listening in. If you don't know politicians, if you don't know people in that space, you're missing an opportunity to have the over coffee or over beer conversation that helps bridge that divide. Science engagement can be as simple as having a coffee or a beer with your member of parliament and talking to them about their perspectives about these scientific issues, and recognizing that they're coming from a position of values and what the voters think, and that doesn't make them wrong if they don't agree immediately with your perspective on science. But that, I think, the science politics conversation is one that needs to happen more so that we're more comfortable having it in the public sphere.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. And increasingly, scientists are actively engaged in informing and helping to shape some of the policy initiatives. Slightly shifting gears before we begin to wrap up and wind down. One of the things that I've been wondering more about during the pandemic and this vaccine hesitancy is wondering whether we're not doing a good enough job actually helping people understand about the nature and processes of scientific inquiry itself. In Canada, I'd say more than half of our kids are leaving after grade 10. They're not finishing high school with the senior level STEM credits. And I'm worried that when they do leave, they don't actually have a good grounding, often that understanding of what scientific inquiry truly means and the changing nature of discovery and the addition of knowledge doesn't happen until you're actually doing research yourself. So how do we help people understand that it's actually great that scientists are learning from each other and contributing to a body of knowledge, and things might be changing, but could we actually take this opportunity to leverage that level of knowledge a bit differently? Isabel, did you have some thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. It's been so interesting for someone, I think about science communication all the time, to just see, I think it's been a long time since we've had such a focus, like the public being so focused and engaged with, current events that are so connected to science. So it's been interesting to see how the public has interacted with the different scientific things that, how scientific understanding has changed over the course of the pandemic. I think in particular about how some public health guidance has changed over time, and how many times, I have seen or heard people say they used to tell us not to do X or to do X and it didn't matter. And now the guidance has changed. So, that just shows that, science isn't worth much or that kind of thing. But for me, that comes in, it gets me in the heart, because I want to say no, it shows exactly that science is working, and that, scientists are open to changing their mind as new, and, we have a model of understanding and it changes over time as you see more evidence and so on. So I think it's made very explicit the fact that people don't necessarily understand the process of science. And I think it comes back to some of the earlier comments about what's important to convey, I think, in science education isn't as much the knowledge, because the knowledge does change and it does, you don't always need the same pieces of knowledge and so on, but it's more understanding the process of critical thinking and scientific discovery and so on. So I think there's a really good opportunity to do that in the current context. Thinking back to like the space race and how it shaped people's engagement with science and excitement for science and so on. Obviously a pandemic is not the same kind of excitement, and there's a lot of tragedy connected to it, but maybe there's some opportunity in there to reinvigorate the discussion around science as well.
Super. So we have about 90 seconds left for our rapid fire. We've covered a lot of ground today. It's been delightful talking to Felix, to Jason, and to Isabel. One quick round, Jason, Felix, then Isabel, what's your key priority? What are the thing we have to focus on most in the next little while?
You've heard it already. So the audience I'm talking to are university leaders, and there's lots of you hopefully listening in. It's about bringing engagement between science and society into the education process, not leaving it on the outside. And I'll just put a plug to the fact that we're running 2 How to Change the World recovery programs in Canada in February and in March with universities across Canada. So please reach out if you'd like to know more.
Felix.
I'll just add to that call to action. We need to put science engagement center stage in anything we do in academia. And we need to make it all about engagement, and whatever form you choose, that's up to the scientists, but do it. Let's change the conversation.
Isabel, priority.
Yeah, so priority for myself and my team at Let's Talk Science, thinking a lot about equity and how the pandemic has brought to light a lot of inequity that's already existed, but it's amplified, and how can we make sure that we reach all audiences, whether or not they're digitally connected or not. And I think for everyone who is listening, just get out there, try science outreach. It's so much fun, it's so rewarding, and encourage your students and your colleagues as well to partake, and just let's all fight the Carl Sagan effect together.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a delightful panel. My clock is now turned off. Everyone who's watching, I can't figure out how to stop this thing, so I'll turn the volume off. You can find us on the platform. And thanks to all the speakers in the Royal Society for today's opportunity. Thanks.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, Felix.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.